So tonight's presentation, what's that raptor? This is really, it came about from a request that was made to me to do an identification presentation on raptors. And it was an opportunity for me to dig out from a number of my image collections, some of those images which actually I would never normally use for publications or anything like that because they're so bad. But the usefulness of them is that they actually represent, by and large, what most of us actually encounter when we're looking at raptors. We don't tend to see glorious close-ups. So going to my first image, which shows a female merlin here, which is a nice close-up. You're not likely to see this very often unless you're very lucky. And the more likely kind of image of a raptor is usually a distant one. So my first take-home point from this whole presentation is that any book that helps to steer you towards identifying raptors correctly should necessarily not just show you a lovely, those are very distant images, and actually a number of silhouettes. This is the kind of slide I was referring to earlier on, the one that I would never have dreamt of showing normally because it's a speck in the sky, but it's the speck in the sky that actually is so important. And if you're going to aspire to becoming a good raptor watcher, there's no such thing as it's too far away. I defy anybody to show me a raptor and information about it. This particular photograph shows you a bird, and you wouldn't appreciate this because it's a still photograph, but I can tell you that that bird was hanging motionless in the air. And straight away, that piece of behavior narrows down the options. Even if you can see very little in the way of detail on the bird, you know that this is a bird which is capable of hanging in the air at a reasonable height. And you can see that below it, there's kind of open hilly country, which again narrows down the options. So what I'm going to be trying to do in the opening part of the presentation is talk about the factors that I think are really important. Now, I do appreciate that I'm speaking to a very erstwhile and learned group of ornithologists in their own right. So forgive me if any of this is, stuff you already are well familiar with. But there may be some people who are still on the learning curve and, find some of this useful and valuable. This happens to be a common buzzard, a bird that routinely will, as we all know, very regularly hover, sometimes using the wind as the assistance to actually hanging in the air. It's not quite as good a bird at hovering as the kestrel. And you might say, well, how come this isn't a kestrel? Well, even with this rather distant slide, you can see a rather small head compared with the body, whereas a kestrel's head, being a smaller raptor, is going to be proportionally larger in relation to the body. Neither can you see a long tail on this bird, which of course would be there if you were dealing with a kestrel. Now, the advanced level students amongst you, or even university graduates, might say, well, what about rough-legged buzzard? Well, yes, it could be. But in this particular case, where we were was hillside in North Wales. So statistically, your chances are going to be lower of seeing a rough-legged buzzard. Plus, the photograph was taken in summer, and rough-legged tends to be a winter visitor. So that's a little bit about that picture. If we look at the whole subject, the whole classification of raptors, just in case anybody wants to know what we're actually talking about, well, it's those birds which fall into the order Falconiformes. And you can see that the Falconiformes are made up of 5 families. It used to be 4, but they recently split off the osprey into its own family, the Panionidae. What you can see here, I'm not going to go into raptor classification because that's a whole talk in itself, But you can see that an awful lot of the raptors are lumped into one big family, the Accipitidae, which necessarily has been split from the Falconidae, which includes the falcons and caracaras. Then you've got some very small families, which either have, in the case of the Cathartidae, only 7 species, or in the case of the secretary bird and the osprey, they are the sole representatives in their own family. So that gives you a quick whistle-stop tour on the classification of the birds we call raptors. Now, a lot of authorities, and I'm not an authority, but I would subscribe to the idea that the owls are also raptors. And I noticed that, pleasingly, when reference was made to raptors earlier on this evening, the short-eared owl was regarded as a raptor, and I would agree with that. So the raptors are included. For this talk, I am not going into talking about the owls because it would make the talk last way longer than I'm scheduled. So I'm going to narrow down my talk to the species you can see here. And if I have time, I'll throw in 1 or 2 additional species, which we occasionally get in Britain and more likely to be seen on the continent. So one of the things I think is a useful take-home message if you're identifying raptors is, first and foremost, is to decide how big the bird is. Now, that's a difficult one sometimes because you may not have a comparator. So you may be guessing how large it is. But if you are able to, straight away, if you, for example, determine that it's a small raptor, you may have seen the bird's wing beat quite rapid. You may have seen it doing very tight turning circles in the air, which indicates a small raptor. You may have seen it acting in a rather erratic way, which is typical of smaller raptors. Then you are actually narrowing the field down a lot. You've only really got 4 to play with in this country. And if it was not in high summer, you could eliminate hobby, of course, because that's a total migrant. So again, getting the size right is important. Now, the aficionados amongst you will look at this and say, well, hang on a minute, we've got sparrowhawk in small, but we know that a sparrowhawk is actually not just one size. We know that the female is sometimes substantially larger than the male. So this categorization of size is extremely crude, and it's only indicating a rough sort of position in that size scale. The reality is you've got a spectrum of sizes, and even within the species, you can have 2 different sizes when you have what we call reverse size dimorphism, which is not uncommon amongst raptors. Now, the first question, if we're trying to identify raptors, is it a raptor? Well, good question, because a lot of birds do a pretty good impersonation of raptors. I mean, a raven at a distance can look very raptor-like, and many birds can actually masquerade as raptors. So the first thing we need to decide on is it a raptor? And there are certain things about raptors that tend to stand out. They tend to have a blunt-looking head. They tend to have wings which are far towards the front of the body rather than positioned towards the rear. Tail lengths can vary enormously. If the bird is sitting, a lot of raptors sit in an upright position if they're able to, but some raptors with long tails and long wings actually aren't able to do that if they're sitting on the ground. Things like red kites and hen harriers and so on have to sit in a more horizontal posture. One thing you usually notice with a raptor is the fact that it doesn't have much of a bill in projecting forwards. A lot of birds, like corvids, actually show a decent sized bill. So straight away, if you see a lack of an obvious projecting bill, that may steer you towards, the idea of it being a raptor. I've mentioned size already, so I won't repeat myself too much on that. But to me, that's actually one of the most important factors. Now, the next one I think is extremely important if you're trying to narrow down which raptor you're looking at. And the first thing I usually do when I'm looking at a raptor, many of which are in flight, is I actually try to determine the wing to tail dimensions. Now, that can sometimes be difficult. If the bird's flying away from you or towards you, you may not be able to see that, and you may have to wait until the bird turns the corner before you actually appreciate the full size. The flight pattern is very important. I mean, if it's got rapid winnowing wing beats, that can be very different from, for example, a bird like a red kite, which tends to have a lazier flight. So how it flies is very important. That backs into its hunting behavior. The word shape kind of encompasses wing to tail dimensions, head size, everything that you can think about, whether the bird is sitting or flying. And this very crude little sketch that I put in before we look at photographs is intended to show something which doesn't always get emphasized, in my view, enough in bird books. And that is the ability of a bird to actually change its shape. Now, this is intended to be a picture of a sparrowhawk. And if you look at the this outline here with the stretched out wing with a very straight front edge to the wing, that would be a soaring sparrowhawk. And often sparrowhawks soar actually with their tails closed, but they of course can fan their tails, as we can see here. But look what happens if you can imagine the bird deciding to get into a more level flight or even a fast stoop. Then the wings necessarily actually pull in. And what happens is that the tip of the wing, instead of showing a blunt fingered end, then closes and becomes pointed. And this can throw people into foreign territory when they're trying to identify birds, because they may regard the bird they're looking at as being a sharp-winged raptor. And this then often results in misidentifications. So I think you have to always remember that birds can change shape according to what they're doing. And therefore, no one picture in a book is ever going to give you the full story. You need lots and lots of different pictures showing the bird in full soar, gliding, stooping, etc., etc. All of those pictures are really important. Otherwise, you can end up getting into foreign territory. Another factor which I think is crucial in raptor identification is habitat. For example, you're not likely, in my experience, to see any of our harrier species flying through thick forest. They just don't do it. Whereas sparrowhawk or goshawk are perfectly at home in that habitat. So knowing where birds should be and the kind of habitat they operate within, I think again is a major clue. So if you can see how this is building up, we've got a number of factors. It's a bit like an evidential set of factors, all of which then go into a kind of computer, and out of that comes an identification. Now, the more experienced you become, the more immediate all of those factors are computed, and that's how I do it. The one thing you might notice is that time of year is another important factor. The time of year determines, for example, whether we should be seeing a hobby in the middle of December or not. I have had people claim that they've seen a hobby at that time of the year. Now, I've learned over the years never to say never. I always work on likelihoods. So I would never say to somebody that is not possible. And I think the danger is if you say it is impossible, you might come a cropper. So I'd always work on likelihood, but I would encourage anybody identifying raptors to say, you know, where am I? What time of year is it? Is it in the right habitat, etc., etc. And then that tends to help to steer away from the misidentifications which otherwise might occur. Possibly one of the least important factors in the first round of identification is the color. And the reason I say that is because so many times you're going to see a bird against a white sky where you don't see the color properly. And if you become too reliant on color, again, raptors are notoriously difficult because they have so many different plumage phases, and immatures and adults and so on can be different in color. There are some raptor species which are very diagnostic in their color, but many others where color actually can be very, very misleading. So whenever I'm talking about raptors or teaching raptors or raptor identification, I always suggest to people, leave that one out. If you can identify raptors without the need to see the color, then you're really going to make it, because otherwise, if you rely on color when it's the light's against you, you're going to be in trouble. Now, I'm not. This isn't all diagrams, incidentally. There are going to be some photographs, so don't worry. But I think this is quite important. One of the things about raptors is that they have inherently what we call a low wing loading. And that's why they, generally speaking, are very good at flying and gliding without having to beat their wings quite as often as other birds might. And basically, wing loading is all about the weight of the body versus the wing surface area. It's the reason why we don't see puffins soaring majestically on a hot summer's day. They've got a very high wing loading, whereas the raptors, being fairly large in the wing surface area generally, and also, crucially, they're carnivores. And that means that they actually have a smaller digestive tract than many other birds, the vegetarians, for example. So raptors inherently are good flyers. That's as a result of those two factors. I'm going to show you a quick diagram of a fictitious raptor here. And this is, my apologies for my rather poor artwork, but this actually shows you all the key features which I'm going to be referring to. So we're going to have, for example, flight feathers, which are the primaries and the secondaries. We're going to be talking about upper wing coverts, the wing coverts here. If the wing was on the underside, you'd be seeing the underwing coverts. And those are the feathers which make up this bit of the wing here. I don't know if you can see my arrow here. We're going to talk about tails. We're going to talk about terminal bands, subterminal bands, rump, a very often misidentified feature of a bird. A lot of people look at the undertail coverts and call that the rump. The rump is, of course, here, and that's quite important in some species of raptor. Some of them have a prominent supercilium. That's the eyebrow. That's distinct from eye stripe, which again is often confused with supercilium. I'm a bit of a pedant when it comes to making sure that actually supercilium is the word you use, or eyebrow, I don't mind which. And very importantly, halfway along the wing or thereabouts, you've got the carpal joint. And quite a lot of raptors have got coloration around the carpal joint. And I'm going to be referring to that. And that's where the wing bends, of course, when we see a bird going into a glide. So that's a very quick and rather crude anatomical assessment of a bird. I have put in this bit here. We call the bit which is on the outside of the carpal joint, we call that the hand. Okay, birds don't have hands as such, but it's what would have been the hand actually on the pentadactyl limb, and we still call it the hand when we're referring to a raptor identification. So that's a little bit of the anatomy there. So let's have a look at some raptors, and I'm going to start off with the falcons, and you'll probably remember that the falcons belong to a smaller group, and recent DNA profiling has told us that they are in the, well, they were in the falconiforms, but the recent findings are that they actually are more closely related through their DNA to parrots. And this is why in your county bird report, you'll see merlin, peregrine, hobby, and kestrel actually detached away from all of the other raptors, because what you're actually looking at in this picture is a kestrel, but that actually is what was a parrot back in evolutionary time, and through what we call convergent evolution, it has actually acquired characteristics which are so similar to other raptors that the early taxonomists quite understandably categorized them as raptors. And at the moment, I think that's where most people see them. But it may be that future bird books might extract them from the raptors, who knows. The kestrel shows a number of raptor features, or a number of falcon features, very important. All of the falcons, and in Britain we've only got really 4 which regularly turn up in the UK, plus 1 or 2 which are irregulars. All of them have a dark eye in this country. There are 1 or 2 falcons in other countries like Africa which have got a pale iris, but all of them in this country have a dark eye. They also show pointed wings. All of them have got long pointed wings, and that is crucial if you're identifying a small raptor. Look at the wing length, look how pointed they are, and that will steer you towards either a falcon, or possibly, if the wings are blunt and rounded, it might be that you're thinking more like a sparrowhawk type bird. The kestrel, when it does this, is actually not too difficult, because it is the only small raptor which routinely hovers in this country. And it's an unusual raptor, or an unusual falcon, because of this hunting style. It doesn't use great speed like so many other falcons do. And secondly, it has a long tail. And many falcons have got very long wings, but they don't actually have a particularly long tail. Kestrel is unusual in its tail length. We can see why that tail is so important by looking at this male. This is an adult male that we're looking at here, and you can see that he's got his tail maximally fanned out, and it's being used here as a counterbalance. The bird is actually attempting to keep its head absolutely stationary to the ground whilst it's actually hovering, and that's how they manage to accurately pinpoint any prey underneath them on the ground. And that could be as small as a beetle or a small vole, whatever it may be. It's quite astonishing what they can do. But it is unusual in that sense. And another unusual feature, which again helps us to separate out kestrel from the other small raptors, is this brick red coloration on the upper parts. And that is present in both the male and female. The male, on the other hand, if you're looking into sexing and aging raptors, the adult male shows, as you can see in this picture, a nice grey, bluey grey crown. And also, if you looked at his upper tail, that is also grey. And you can see the subterminal band is black. There is actually a terminal band which is white, but the subterminal band is black. Otherwise, on a fairly plain grey tail. Now, a kestrel hovering is pretty easy. A kestrel in level flight could be a little bit more difficult. And I don't mind admitting, over the years, there's been occasions when I've looked at one cutting low over the ground and thought to myself, is this a kestrel that I'm looking at? Because they can do quite a good job of impersonating other raptors, for example, like Merlin. And if you don't get good coloration on them, the sensible thing to do is wait until the bird does something like hovers, or if it lands and you can see the tail length. If you can't see the tail length, then you're best off waiting until it lands or doing something else. By and large, I find that kestrels have a flight pattern which is, how can I put this? It's a little bit more lazy and sort of wimpish than a Merlin, which could be a confusion species in open country. They overlap, of course, in habitat. You can go to some places where you'll see both Merlin and kestrel. So again, trying to separate out those two small falcons relies sometimes on getting a reasonably decent view. Now, I'm going to depart from the UK just for a second, because the advanced bird watchers amongst you will be only too familiar with a bird which actually, and I'm referring, of course, to the lesser kestrel. Now, the lesser kestrel adult male is not too much of a challenge to separate out from common kestrel. And incidentally, in many southern European countries, you get an overlap between these two species. So it's actually quite important to be able to separate them out. In the case of the adult male lesser kestrel, please note that it has no speckling on the upper mantle or the upper wing coverts here. It also, on the greater wing coverts, shows bluey-grey coloration, not present on the common kestrel. And there's no moustachial stripe. And the overall bird tends to look very much paler, almost white on the underside. That's the adult male lesser kestrel. If you throw into that the behavior, which is very gregarious and breeding on cliff edges and buildings in colonies, then that again helps to steer you towards the right identification. The problem occurs with the immatures and the female lesser kestrels. And this is where life becomes more complicated, and you're looking for real subtleties here. One of the subtleties is the length of primary number 10, which is actually longer relatively on a lesser kestrel than it is on a common kestrel. If you look at the ear covert, it's pale on a lesser kestrel, more so than on a common kestrel. And over the top of the eye, the dark line that you see on a common kestrel is not present on a lesser, which gives the eye a rather staring appearance, slightly sort of dove-like, actually. The tail, in fact, if anything, is slightly shorter in relation to the wings than it is on a common kestrel. So the wing-to-tail ratio is different on a lesser kestrel. And if you were to get a real close-up, you would notice that the talons are not black. They are a sort of bone colour rather than black. So a number of things which would help you sort out the female, and indeed this, which is an immature lesser kestrel. Even the leading authorities on raptor identification admit that this is one of the most difficult challenges in the field, particularly where you have isolated birds away from the breeding area. It can be really tricky. You need to get a good view of a lesser kestrel. So we're back to Britain, and this is the country that I spend an awful lot of time in doing monitoring of breeding raptors. And my next little raptor, falcon that is one which I particularly like spending time with. This is the merlin. And the merlin breeds in the kind of habitat you're looking for, heather-covered moorland. And in the winter, they also like really wild, remote places. So all of these are clues as to whether you're looking at a merlin or not. When people claim that they've had a merlin in their garden, I always sort of, question in my mind whether they actually have made a correct identification. And unless the garden is in a wild kind of place on the edge of an estuary, I would tend to be a little dubious as to whether this actually is a merlin. They very seldom, if ever, go into gardens. But as I said earlier on, never say never, and I would always take any claim seriously, but I would want to see evidence. And very, very rarely do I ever see any compelling evidence of merlins in gardens when claims are made. It's usually a misidentification in my experience. Now, the merlin is one of the most dynamic of our little falcons, and everybody, I'm sure, who's listening to this will have had a chance to see merlins. I hope you have. They are dynamic, they are energetic, in contrast with a kestrel, which drifts around a bit aimlessly and then hovers for a while. In my view, the merlin always seems to know exactly where it's going. It's going from A to B, and it doesn't seem to have any doubt as to where it's going. That's point number one. They tend to hug the ground unless they're chasing a prey, or they're mobbing an intruder or displaying. Most of the time, merlins like to fly low, and they like to perch low as well, actually. This is a male that happened to be turning a corner at the time of the photograph. And what you can see here is it has got the typical long pointed wings of a falcon, but notice that the tail, although not as long as a kestrel, is still not that short either. It's a medium length tail. And whenever you see a tail which is medium length, that tells you that it's there for a reason. And merlins are very good at twisting and turning after their prey. They're like a heat-seeking missile when they're chasing their prey. So that's an important feature on a merlin. Again, we're looking at an adult male here in level flight. And if you look at the way they fly, a lot of the emphasis on a merlin is on the downbeat. They have this flicking wing beat where it's a crisp kind of action, and they hug the ground, and they're very fast. If you were to confuse a merlin with something, particularly up on moorland in the summer, you might confuse it with a cuckoo, because a cuckoo can actually look a wee bit like a merlin, particularly if you can't see the tail length on the bird. As the adult male gets older, his blueness seems to get better and more blue. And this bird I got to know over many years. I think he was the same bird, I'm quite sure he was, that came back year after year to breed in one particular place. And he was one of the smartest merlins I think I've seen, actually. This is a slightly younger male, and you can see there's actually a retained immature feather here. One of the tertials hasn't yet molted out, and that shows a brown coloration. So when they're turning from immature through to adult, you'll possibly sometimes see them go through this halfway stage where they are holding on to some of their brown feathers from their immature plumage. Incidentally, just for clarification, juvenile is the first plumage, immature is the plumages between juvenile and adult, and then you've got adult. Raptors, pretty accurately, they're either juveniles or in their immature plumage. What we can't do is gauge them with any level of accuracy. All you can say is adult, if that makes sense. Now this is a female, and as well as being a little different in colour, because she's showing the brown coloration as you'd expect with a female merlin, she's also noticeably larger than her male counterpart. She comes in at about 14 inches. He's somewhere around 11 inches. So she's a bigger bird. Other than that, head to body ratio is a little smaller than the male because she's a bigger bird. And there's this rule of thumb, I should say, in ornithology, that the bigger the bird gets, the smaller the head is in relation to the body. And it works quite well when you've got dimorphic species like merlin. Here she is in flight, different bird actually, this one, but it's a female merlin. And again, you can see that long wings and medium length tail. And again, turned on, looked at from the upper side, you can see a squared off tail, unlike a kestrel, which has got a little bit of a kind of wedge on the tail with the longer middle tail feathers compared with the outer ones. A juvenile, literally just fledged out, looks like this, and if you notice the skin around the eye is actually blue, unlike the adult bird, which will have yellow. So you can, and it hangs on to that rather blue skin for a while actually. So again, you can say with reasonable confidence this is a young bird. Otherwise, it's very difficult to age them. Now, this bird was an interesting one because he looks, I say he, I've given the game away. This bird looks like a female in coloration. And you can imagine my surprise when another brown merlin turned up and they copulated. Well, the story is that actually this is a male, but he's in his first calendar year. And at that point, I say second calendar year, and at that point in his second calendar year, he's an immature, but he hasn't molted into his blue plumage. But I guess he was good enough for the female in this particular case, and sure enough, he was a good enough bird too. So when you look at a brown merlin, be careful you don't automatically assume that it's a female. It could be an immature male, and we'll come across this phenomenon elsewhere. A lot of the time when you see a merlin in the winter time, it'll be out on a wild open country, sometimes rough old fields, sometimes good place as any is the D estuary, where you're virtually guaranteed to see them on these sort of salt marshes out there. So whilst we're still on the subject of falcons, let's talk about the next one. This is the summer visiting falcon with the longest wings in relation to the body, the hobby. And we don't tend to get hobbies coming in until the back end of April, and they're only with us a relatively short time, and they're more or less gone around about September time. Sometimes a little bit later, but generally speaking, September. So it's a short duration they're with us for. Now, the hobby has some of the coloration, which is reminiscent of peregrine, this kind of hooded look and white cheek. So again, if you were going to confuse a hobby with something, you might confuse it with a peregrine. But for me, the hobby's wing action is utterly different. It's an elastic wing. It's not got that stiff, powerful look of a peregrine. The hobby is a graceful, very flexible looking bird in flight. And typically they tend to fly and do sort of sudden jinks in flight where they catch dragonflies and the like. So it's a very different flight pattern. Seen from the upper side, again, you can see how rather peregrine-like the bird is, just looking at its coloration. But if you were to see the movie footage of this, straight away, you could see that different flight action. They are daintier as well, of course. They don't have the body width of a peregrine. And whilst we're on the subject of peregrines, you've probably already spotted the character up here in the sky. Again, habitat is going to steer you in the right direction, because peregrines invariably like to breed on inaccessible places, inland quarries, sea cliffs, buildings, all of those kind of things. And that's where you might likely encounter them. They regularly use old nests of other birds. And incidentally, a useful take-home message, or point, I should say, is that none of these falcons actually build a nest. It seems that the gene for building a nest is not there in the falcons. And it may relate to their parrot ancestry, which were by and large hole nesters. So all the falcons actually rely on an existing structure, or at the very most, they'll make a bit of a scrape on the ground like merlins do. Peregrines, of course, have been supremely successful in urban settings, and it's quite common now to find places all over the country where peregrines are nesting on churches and tall buildings. This one, actually down in the southwest of England, shows the female up here. The male is actually, this was a perfect place and plenty of prey in the shape of feral pigeons in the town. Looked at again and comparing this directly with some of the other falcons we've been talking about, you can see this barrel-chested look of peregrine. The head of a peregrine, I think, sticks out further. It looks longer in the head. And the wing action is a stiff, powerful wing action, quite unlike the species we've been talking about earlier on. If you were going to liken the wing action to anything, it's more like a fulmar, actually, for those of you who know the fulmar's flight action. I think a peregrine has a very similar flight action. The tail is actually, again, quite a short tail, relatively, compared with, for example, kestrel. So there's a few of the pointers about it. This is an adult bird. You can see the very, very beautiful white upper breast, which goes into barring on the lower breast and belly. So that's in its full adult plumage. Again, going back to an earlier point, you can see what happens when the bird is doing a maneuver. The wing sort of maximally splays out. Interestingly, they don't have emarginated primaries, which in some species shows that intensely fingered look. Even when a peregrine like this one is maximally splaying its wing, you don't see the same level of fingering as you would do on, for example, a common buzzard. Look also at the alula. This is the little mini wing, which actually helps to stabilize the bird when it's doing a complex maneuver. It's just like the aileron on an aeroplane when you're coming into land. It stops the bird from stalling. And when this bird was trying to sort of turn a corner, it's using its tail as a brake, so it's fanning its tail maximally. And again, that will close pretty quickly when the bird stops doing that complex maneuver. We know peregrines, of course, are capable of some of the most extraordinary speeds. There's been estimates ranging from 150 miles an hour to 200 miles an hour when a peregrine's stooping. And there's nothing more thrilling when we see that, particularly if you're out in the right place. This is one sitting on a cliff edge, and you can see again all the adult features, heavy moustachial stripes, a sort of greyish with a hint of slaty blue on the upper parts, stocky looking bird, very heavy. This is a female peregrine. Again, the female compared with the male has that greater bulk, greater size, and if you look at her wing depth or wing breadth where it meets the body, she's got a broader wing where it meets the body, so you can actually sex peregrines even in flight. The freshly fledged young bird shows a completely different arrangement of colors, and you can see that instead of having bars, it's got sort of stripes, and those streaks or stripes will continue on right the way through until that's an adult bird, and it will eventually molt out those feathers and show the more barred appearance. Plus, the upper breast will become much paler. So this is a juvenile bird that you're looking at in this particular picture. I mentioned the thrill of seeing peregrines in full stoop. This was a nice moment in the background. And here's a bunch of red shanks doing a sort of handbrake turn, a fun thing to see. Not if you're a red shank, of course. I'm just going to take you momentarily to one or two other places just to mention one or two other falcons. I've had the great fortune of traveling to Iceland quite a few times in the last decade or two. And one of the birds I most wanted to catch up with was a bird I eventually did. This is the gyrfalcon, and this is a very distant picture showing a pair sitting up on a volcanic formation, which they can sometimes breed on, actually. The gyrfalcon is like a peregrine on anabolic steroids. It's an immensely powerful bird. It is the biggest falcon in the world. Again, it shows so many of the features: long wings, not a particularly long tail, fantastic speed in flight, and it uses that speed to overcome ptarmigan and Barrow's goldeneye and whatever it wants to catch when it's hunting. The female was in the previous picture. This is the male. You can't put any weight on the colors here because they vary quite a bit, actually. And we have, across the world, we have three races of gyrfalcon: the Icelandic bird, the Greenland bird, and the Scandinavian bird, all of which vary a little bit in their coloration. I won't go into that in too much detail, but I just want to show you this picture, which shows that the female actually is the dominant bird. The male had the effrontery to sit on her perch, and here she is coming in and displacing him off the perch. So she is the boss in this relationship. A couple of other raptors which occasionally come up into Europe. This is the Lanner falcon, which is, if anything, it's going to be close to, I would suggest, probably closer to peregrine, but longer in the tail, but uses a lot of the techniques that peregrines do for hunting. And there we have a Lanner in flight. And the other one, which occasionally makes it to Britain, actually, is the red-footed falcon, a bird which is in its sort of flight dimensions very similar to the hobby. But unlike a hobby, red-footed falcons actually are happy to perch on wires. And it might be worth noting that there are some birds which will perch on wires and others which won't. I have never seen a hobby in my life perching on a telegraph wire. That's not to say they don't ever, but I've never seen one. And similarly, I've never seen a merlin perching on a telegraph wire, but I've regularly seen kestrel, and of course red-footed falcon I've seen perching on telegraph wires. Now, I did mention confusion species, and there's no shame in ever suggesting that you might have seen a raven at a distance and thought, oh, is this a raptor? It does a very good impersonation, particularly if a raven's soaring at a great distance. You know, it can actually look a wee bit raptor-like. So again, there are birds which do good impersonations. This brings me on to my next little group of raptors, which are the forest raptors. We only have two in this country. The one which belongs to the genus Accipiter. They're known as accipiters in the kind of raptor speak. And this, of course, is the sparrowhawk. This is an adult male sparrowhawk, and is sort of lower mantle plumage. And you can see that it reveals white spots. All that will disappear when he tightens his plumage again. So again, don't be drawn into thinking that's an important identification feature. They can do it, but they can also hold that white plumage under the feathers. The size difference in sparrowhawks is astonishing. This is an adult male, and you can see the beautiful rufous colour, and you can see these bluey grey upper parts. What you do notice is, look where the primary feathers come to on this perched bird. Nowhere near the tip of the tail. The tail greatly exceeds the length of the wings. And that's an important adaptation if you're going to fly through forest. Again, we've got a second calendar year male, which came and landed on my garden wall some years ago. And here you can see once again the wings are quite short and blunt, whereas the tail is quite a full, a substantial tail. Just to emphasize the size of a sparrowhawk, this particular male had the misfortune of flying and trying to catch a small bird in our buddleia bush. Luckily, I managed to rescue it because the bird had hooked itself up by its own leg in the bush. And I managed to extract it, and I got Linda, my wife, to actually take a photograph of me holding it. The reason I wanted that was to show how tiny a male sparrowhawk is. And this is what leads people into thinking they've seen a merlin in the garden. They, maybe from lack of experience, will go to their book, look at rufous underparts, look at bluey grey upper parts, and they'll say it's really small. And I've had people be a sparrowhawk, and I say to them, well, do you know how small a male sparrowhawk actually is? And that actually is the crucial point. And when they tell me that they definitely think it was a merlin because they could see those nice yellow eyes, that clinches it. And I have to say, no, it can't be a merlin. No merlin shows yellow in the eye at any stage of its life. So this is more likely to be a sparrowhawk. And in fact, sparrowhawks not only have sometimes yellow eyes in the immature bird, but as the male or female get older, particularly the male, he can acquire amber-coloured eyes like this bird, which was in the buddleia bush. Just to re-emphasize the massive difference in size, what you're looking at here is two males and a female. These are two immature males, but fully grown. So they would never have been bigger than that, even if they reached adult plumage. This is an adult plumage, fully grown female. And this is why not only do we get claims of merlins in gardens, we also get claims of goshawks in gardens, because very often a female sparrowhawk, if she does come into a garden, can do quite a good impersonation of a goshawk. And to the untrained eye, the female shows a big, broad white supercilium, not dissimilar to a goshawk. But if you look at the leg dimensions, the tarsus thickness, we call this, you'll see that they're sort of knitting needle type legs, not the thick legs of a goshawk, which is rather different in that respect. Here we have a sparrowhawk in flight, and you can see very importantly a squared off, longish tail, rounded wing, broadish in the wing and rounded, which is exactly what the bird needs for twisting and turning through trees. And that's what they're so good at. So all of this, in a sense, is a compromise, because the sparrowhawk has relinquished, if you like, through evolution, some of its wing length in favor of having mobility through dense vegetation. And the tail has become a very effective rudder. So when you next see a sparrowhawk come into your garden, marvel once again at how the bird can change direction and twist and turn around the bird table with apparent ease. Again, we're looking at a sparrowhawk in flight here, emphasizing again the longish tail and the blunt rounded wings. And you can see from the upper side again, same idea here. This is an immature bird actually. You can see that it's an immature because of the fringing we call on the upper wing coverts here. So that's a bird which hasn't yet come into its adult plumage. On the subject of goshawk, which of course has to follow on because we just talked about sparrowhawk, and very importantly, it's determining whether you're looking at a big female sparrowhawk or a male goshawk. And that can be a little bit tricky sometimes. Goshawks exude bulk. They are the barrel-chested versions of sparrowhawks. It's a sparrowhawk on anabolic steroids again, showing a smaller head-to-body ratio. And goshawks are birds of wilder country generally in this country. In Scandinavia now there's, and indeed in Berlin, there's the urban goshawk. So it may be that in time we're going to find goshawks start coming into our cities and towns like they are already in other parts of Europe. But by and large, if you're looking for goshawks, you need to go to wild, sort of uninhabited forest in order to find them. And that's where this bird was sitting one morning. And they do like actually sitting overlooking a glade because they are a surprise hunter. They tend to launch off very quickly if they see something inadvertently passing, and they will overcome it fairly quickly with a short chase. Neither sparrowhawk nor goshawk are really adapted to long, relentless chases, like, for example, a merlin. They just don't have the speed. So if they don't catch quickly, they don't carry on chasing for too long. Now, if you look at this flight picture of a goshawk, this was a very old picture, but it really does show the difference. First of all, a rounded tail compared with the squared off tail of a sparrowhawk. Also, the tail to body ratio isn't as long as on a sparrowhawk. But if you look at the body, you can see this incredibly inflated body compared with the thin body of a sparrowhawk. The head to body ratio is smaller. I've mentioned that already. And the other thing we notice with a goshawk is that the hand is slimmer than on the sparrowhawk. All of those should be factors that you would look at when you're trying to determine whether you're dealing with goshawk or sparrowhawk, because it's not fair to say that a goshawk is merely a big sparrowhawk. It's very, very different in its dimensions and shape. And here we have a slightly closer view of adult, nearly adult sparrowhawk, goshawk, which is actually chasing off another a rival bird at the time of the photograph being taken. And I'd like to draw your attention to another factor here, which is this what we call bulging secondaries. When you look at the rear edge of the wing, the breadth of the wing halfway along is actually broader than it is where it joins the body. So we call that bulging secondaries, and that shows very well on a soaring goshawk. Actually, another feature which should be mentioned, this rather odd looking gleaming white area here is, believe it or not, the undertail coverts. And in the springtime, the goshawk seems to allow these undertail coverts to flow over the top of the tail, creating what almost looks like a white rump, but it isn't. It's actually the undertail coverts spilling out over the top of the tail. I think they deliberately do it as a display feature, and they can look very odd, and the whole tail looks weird, where this great wodge of white plume is sort of obscuring what is the real tail. The immature goshawk shares many of the features: the rounded tail, the short wings, the narrow hand. But also, if you look at the streaking on the underbreast, that would rule out sparrowhawk. There's no sparrowhawk that will ever show those sort of teardrop-shaped black markings on the underbreast. So there we have it. So let's move on to harriers. I'm keeping my eye on the time, and I'm just seeing if we can whiz through harriers very quickly and one or two others, and then I think my time will probably be up. The harriers which we have are by and large only three. Hen harrier is the one I'm most familiar with because that's what I do a lot of work on. And you can see one feature very importantly of the what we call the shallow dihedral. When a harrier flies and glides, it tends to lift its wings into a V shape, and that is very useful. Here we have an adult male hen harrier, again showing the wings sort of gently canted upwards, and when they stop flapping and they glide, you'll notice that most harriers lift their wings above the horizontal when they're actually playing along. You can see me actually, I'm doing a harrier. Looking at the actual anatomy of the bird, there's a lot about harriers which is a bit different, and I'm not going to go into all of it for the sake of time. Suffice to say, they're long in the wing, they're long in the tail, they're designed for open country hunting and flying fairly slowly over open country. And one other adaptation they do have is a facial ruff or disc, not dissimilar to owls. And this is a means by which their hearing has been enhanced. So when they're hunting, not only are they looking for prey, they're actually listening for it as well, so they can pinpoint whatever's going on underneath them. The term ringtail is sometimes confused, and I think it's a good term because what it tells us is it's a bird that we cannot confidently say is either an adult female, an immature female, or an immature male. All of those are under the overarching term ringtail, and the term ringtail, I think, relates to the unbroken ring of white which actually encircles the bird's rump and the vent as well. So all of these birds are correctly termed ringtail, and it's actually better if you look at a brown hen harrier with a white rump at a distance. It's far better to say I saw a ringtail bird than to try to go a stage beyond that which you have evidence for and say it was an adult female or an adult or an immature male. Unless you have the expertise to do that, it's far better to simply say I saw a ringtail harrier. That's the best term to use under those circumstances. Montagues is a rare bird. In fact, I think not one pair bred in Britain this year, sadly. But we do get occasional birds breeding. There used to be colonies of Montagues, one in Cornwall many, many years ago. But for whatever reason, the Montagues doesn't find it very comfortable in Britain. But if you go down to Spain, you're much more likely to see it, and indeed in France as well. This is the paper aeroplane of the Raptors. It is the lightweight version of the Harriers. The male Montes is only 270 grams in weight. And if you compare that with a female Marsh Harrier, she weighs in at something like 660 grams. So you can see a massive weight difference. Montagues is very, very long in the wing. And if you look at an important point here, there's 4 projecting primaries here. Now, the hen harrier has 5 projecting primaries. So if you're ever in doubt and you can get a feel for how broad the hand is, the broader the hand, the more likely it's going to be a hen harrier. With the adult male Montagues, you shouldn't be in trouble because you've got all this marking on the underwing, and if you look at the upper wing, you've also got that line going through the secondaries on the upper wing of the male Montagues. Here again, you can see the male Montagues with that black line going through the secondary. Whereas if you look at the female Montagues harrier, this is where it starts to get more tricky. And you could find yourself, for example, somewhere either in Britain in the summer where it could be a Montagues, the female, or if you're down in France or Spain, where again both species overlap. So how do you tell the difference? Well, the simple thing here again is to look at the breadth of the hand and to see if you can get a feel for how many projecting primaries there are. And although this sounds like a really subtle difference, I don't think it is. That narrowness of the hand I find very reliable actually. On a bird which is otherwise very similarly coloured to a female hen harrier. The juvenile Montagues is a beautiful bird, fox red on the underbelly and beautiful burnished sort of colours on the upper parts. That's their first plumage. They don't hang on to that for too long, actually, but that's what they look like when they first fledge. I photographed that bird in the September of the year it was born, so that gives you an idea as to the timings. And if that's not enough, there is a dark morph version of Montagu's, which is a rare version, which is probably on a recessive gene. This springs up every so often, and you could be fooled into thinking you're looking at some new species of harrier here. It isn't. It's actually the dark morph of Montagu's. Just to complete the circle here, we've got, of course, marsh harrier, the biggest and heavyweight version of the harrier. This is a female. Now, I actually think that there should be an equivalent term, as there is ringtail for immature hen harriers and adult female hen harriers. So there should be a similar term for marsh harriers, which are these birds which show sort of ochre-coloured scapulars and an ochre-coloured top to the head, and those could be adult females, immature females, or immature males. All of them look a bit similar, and I think we should call them golden heads, and that should be the term that would be the equivalent of ringtails, and I think it could catch on. That's my idea anyway. The male, adult male, is very different. Like he is with so many of the harriers, there's tremendous colour dimorphism in marsh harrier. And this is a typical male, adult male marsh harrier, showing a lot of grey in the wings, not completely grey, and quite a lot of grey in the tail. But notice that he never actually loses the brown, rufusy brown coloration on the underparts. So he's got also rufusy brown on some of the upper parts as well. So again, he's like a kind of halfway house when it comes to grey harriers. The immature bird, this is again a bird born in the year that it was photographed. So we're talking September here, a bird which fledged out in June or July. You see once again very, very similar colorations here. Crown and nape, and the only thing that really tells you it's an immature here is the fringing on the wing coverts here, which are typically pristine at this stage in its life. There's no wear and tear on the wings whatsoever. We do get very, very occasionally pallid harriers. I've never seen one in the UK, but I have seen them in East Africa, where I photographed this bird donkeys years ago. But we get the occasional one, and I'm not going to go into too much detail there. To complete our array of raptors, I'll just quickly mention red kite. You don't need me to help you identify red kite, so I'm going to whiz through this. This is one of my sort of typical early pictures of a red kite. And we all know how to identify them. They're so straightforward. The only bird we've really got, that is a raptor we've got. And you can see the adult bird shows a rufous forked tail, which can twist and turn, and that's why they're so capable of maneuvering, even in sort of relatively small areas. The immature bird doesn't show the rufous tail, neither does it show the rufous underparts. And the eye colour is also another clue on the aging of those. So there we have black kite. Now, I'm showing you this simply because it's not impossible that we might get black kite in Britain before too long. They're only just across the channel, and if the way things go as they have done with other species, things might change and they might cross the channel. This is an immature black kite, showing again all the coloration on the first plumage that the bird has. It won't hang on to that coloration. But if you look at the tail, it's nowhere near as forked as the red kite. So that's one reliable way of separating them. There is another kite which actually isn't related, called the black-shouldered kite or black-winged kite, which you might come across if you go down to certain parts of Spain. And that hovers in a way that kites don't normally do. It's completely unrelated. The Latin name is Elanius caeruleus, unlike the true kites, which belong to the genus Milvus. So it's in a separate group of its own. In the same way you don't need me to help you identify red kite, you probably don't need me to help you identify common buzzard. But common buzzard, although we all know the features of common buzzards, we see them all the time. One thing we must be aware of is the variability in plumage. And also, if you want to age a common buzzard, there are ways of doing it. And one of the most reliable is to look at the eye colour. If you've got a very pale iris, you've got a young bird. And as the bird gets older, the iris gets darker. Otherwise, there aren't actually very many features which help you to age a common buzzard. And no, you can't sex them either, because the sexes are absolutely identical. And there's very little size dimorphism in common buzzards. Here we have one in flight, typically showing the broad wing, short tail, bulky body, fairly large head actually in relation to the body as well. But, and this is the reason why I talk about colours being possibly a confusion factor, this is a common buzzard. And I photographed this in the Netherlands, where in the winter you'll see an awful lot of birds coming across in this plumage. So if there was ever a bird to not rely on colour, it's the common buzzard. And there's been so many misidentifications where people have turned what actually are common buzzards into ospreys and all sorts of things. We do occasionally on the east coast of Britain get the rough-legged buzzard, which is a fairly rare but regular visitor in winter. And this and it usually shows a very white tail with a black terminal band or bands on the tail. I'm not going to go into more detail than that at the moment for the sake of time. I want to just mention honey buzzard, another rare bird in Britain, although probably overlooked. Now this one here, if you were to compare it with common buzzard, look at the tiny little cuckoo-like head, little pigeon head on this, so different from the common buzzard. And that gives the whole shape of the bird a distinction. Honey buzzards very regularly show very heavy carpal patches. This bird is showing it very well. The problem we've got with honey buzzard is that it actually comes in so many different plumages. So again, looking at the way they fly on flat wings without the wings curling up like a common buzzard does, a fairly medium full type of tail, not a short tail. And again, if you look at coloration, here we go. This is one version. This is a honey buzzard. That's a honey buzzard. And so is that a honey buzzard. So you've got about 25 different color morphs, if you like, of honey buzzard to work through. So best learned by its flight action, which is a twisting tail, flat wings, little cuckoo head, and a bit like a goshawk, it actually shows when it's fully stretching its wings. Doesn't show in this picture, but when it stretches its wings fully, you'll notice a bulging sort of secondaries on it, which is a little bit similar to goshawk. Again, osprey, everybody's pretty familiar. I always think that that wing of osprey, that crooked look on a wing, is so distinctive. And there's not another raptor we have which shows this gleaming white top to the head, gleaming white underparts, and very, very dark upperparts. What could you confuse an osprey with? Well, I guess you could confuse it, if anything, with an immature great black-backed gull or something, but there's not much else you'll confuse it with. So again, I'm not going to dwell too much on osprey because it's such an easy one. And finally, and this is finally, we've got two species of eagle, which you probably have to go up to Scotland to enjoy seeing. This is, of course, golden eagle, although there was a long-standing golden eagle, as many of you know, at Cors Karen, which see it and even displayed in the springtime, which is rather nice. This is an immature golden eagle. How does this differ from a common buzzard? Well, the wings are huge, and the head in relation to the body is noticeably smaller. It's a bigger bird. The tail is longer. Again, we've got an immature bird showing a white base to the tail and white bases to the primaries and secondaries, all of which that will be lost when it becomes an adult. But it will hang on to the so-called golden nape that gives the name of the bird golden eagle. And the closest thing, I guess, we have to a vulture is this bird, the white-tailed eagle, which thanks to a tremendous release program is doing very well indeed. And it's also now successfully been released in other places in Britain, Isle of Wight being one of them. So I think there's talk of possibly the white-tailed eagle being reintroduced to Wales, which would be a tremendous addition to the scenery, I would say. In flight, unmistakable. It's not the most elegant-looking bird in flight, dare I say, compared with the golden eagle. It's a big flying barn door with a rather tiny little tail and a rather vulture-eyed look, actually. But it's a fantastic bird to have. And I'm looking at my watch and realizing that I've probably already overstayed my welcome. So with that, everybody, I'm going to finish. And if there are questions and if there's time for questions, I'll be very happy to take them. Thank you very much. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now.
Thank you very much, Keith. That was wonderful. And I'm sure there are a few questions. Keith said he'll happily answer any questions that you have. So please fire away, unless you've already sent some questions via chat to Gary. But please feel free to ask questions from the floor, as it were.
Nigel, can I take the opportunity with Keith? Thank you for the presentation. Really enjoyed it enormously. In terms of distribution of birds, I think we're seeing quite an increase in the sightings of hobbies on Anglesey. Red kites are far more established, and more sightings of goshawk as well. I just wondered what your thoughts were in terms of the range expansion that may be happening with those three species, because you know, there's a lot said about persecution of raptors, but there are some that seem to be pushing boundaries.
It's a really good question, actually, and one which, if I take the three species you've mentioned, I think there are two categories there. Let's take goshawk and red kite, both of which were either exterminated or nearly exterminated during the bad old 1800s. And I think what we've seen, of course, with both is a recovery, and arguably they've re-established themselves. I use the word very carefully, re-established themselves in places where they probably were before. In the case of goshawk, the large tracts of commercial forest have undoubtedly provided the necessary ingredient for that bird to recover really well, and particularly in Wales. And we know Wales is a real stronghold for goshawk now. So that to me is a recovery as a result of, if you like, a bounce back from persecution. There could be a climatic element in that. Although the red kite, of course, is present in far more northerly latitudes than Britain. So I don't think climate is the issue. I think it's literally a recovery from persecution. The hobby, on the other hand, which is the third species you mentioned, I don't have data or hard evidence, but I, like you, think that I'm seeing probably more hobbies. And if you look at the BTO data, you can see that the hobby is now right up onto the borders of Scotland and beyond. Whereas if you look at old bird books, if you read the old Observer's Book of Birds, the hobby was a bird of the southern counties, Hampshire, Wiltshire, Sussex and Surrey. You know, now the hobby can be found breeding in Northumberland and beyond. Now, to me, that probably is due not to lack of persecution, because I can't believe that hobby would have been persecuted in the gamekeeping days. What I think is probably happening here is the very same thing that's actually causing all the shifts and drifts of so many of our species, which are responding to changing climate. I think it could be as simple as that. Again, I think we need to look at long-term hard data to be sure that that is the factor, but I can't think of anything else that would cause the hobby, or indeed many other species, to shift in their distribution in the way that they are. I'm spending a lot of time, as you know, working up on the uplands, and a recent paper in actually British Birds presented some really compelling evidence regarding the impact of climate change on so many of our species. And it was the upland bird particularly which were going to be most affected. And I think I'm noticing that with the way in which, for example, things like ring-ouzel are moving away from some of the grounds that they used to be on. And some of our wading birds are moving away as well. So all those upland birds which belong in that climatic envelope are being affected. We shouldn't therefore be surprised if birds which belong in a climatic envelope, which typically would have been a continental climatic envelope, that they might find parts of Britain now acceptable.
Keith, many thanks for answering Martin's question so fully there. That was brilliant. Any more questions from anybody out there? If I might just pose one to you, Keith, are there any species that, in your experience, are going, as it were, under the radar, particularly here in North Wales, which you feel are being under-recorded, either through lack of field time or field experience by observers, or just because species are particularly secretive?
Yeah, I think it's a very good question, Nigel. The birds which probably, and I'll say this because I can't say, nobody can accurately say to what degree something is under-recorded, because how can we say this?
Yeah.
But the ones I suspect probably are overlooked are honey buzzard. It's a very difficult bird, and I think a lot of honey buzzards are probably overlooked. I'm not the expert on honey buzzard. Steve Roberts is the man who has really demonstrated that when you really look hard for them, you find them. So I think probably honey buzzard is overlooked. Again, a lot of people, through no fault of their own, won't have the experience to separate out honey buzzard necessarily from common buzzard. So that's one of the factors. I think probably merlins might well be overlooked. They are, even when you're intensely watching on breeding ground, it is actually not impossible to overlook them. They can be very secretive sometimes. So those two, I think, are probably the most likely. Birds like, for example, hen harrier, because they're so high profile, a lot of resource is actually put into hen harrier. So I don't think those would be desperately overlooked. In terms of quantifying populations, I would probably say, I was actually talking to somebody today, and I hold my own hands up and say that I don't diligently go around recording every common buzzard, every breeding pair of common buzzards. So if somebody said to me, well, how many are there? I actually don't know. It's just such an abundant bird that it falls off the importance scale in terms of monitoring. And we tend to put our energy into the birds which are perhaps a little less common.
Thank you very much. Any further questions?
Nigel, could I just take the opportunity to ask a further question? I mean, Keith, you've mentioned that you spend a lot of time in the uplands. With the energy crisis that the UK is facing, and the perhaps the decision to go to more wind turbines and the like, what are your thoughts on actually the risks posed, or the ability for wildlife to work with a industry that may actually become more important economically for us, and how things will live together, really?
That's another really important question. Of course, there's always going to be a balance, I guess, where the interests of green energy are going to be balanced against the impact on the countryside. And I am, to some degree, not directly involved, but certainly indirectly involved in this, because I regularly get consultancies coming to me, having been employed by developers to look at potential wind farm development. And I'm very pleased to say that actually the first thing that happens is that they refer to people like me and say, well, what are our data looking like for breeding Schedule 1 raptors in this case? And by being able to provide those data, it does give us a degree of assurance that the developers would have to overcome that objection if they were going to, for example, put wind turbines on an area where a species which is prone to collision with the turbines might actually exist. So ahead of any turbine development, there is an obligation, statutory obligation on the part of the developer to undertake the necessary assessment through an ecological consultancy. They often turn to people like myself, Raptor Study Group Coordinator, to actually come up with the data, which actually will help them present a case, possibly against the development. But of course, all of this depends on how compelling the evidence is that the wind turbines are actually going to cause that particular species a problem. And we know that the slower flying species are the ones which are most likely to encounter problems with wind turbines. So in Spain, for example, vultures are notably the subject of collision with wind turbines.
Well, thanks for the question, Martin. Thanks for the answer, Keith. There, again, very topical. Any other questions? Well, if there aren't,
there's none in the chat, but Rachel says, excellent talk. She's learned a lot. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel.
Okay. Well, Keith, that was absolutely splendid. It was a real treat. We've had a masterclass in Raptor identification this evening. And we can all see why you are such a highly acclaimed photographer. I mean, that was the beauty of it, really, is that you mentioned all our British raptors, and your narrative was excellent and well structured and very clear. But it was being able to then show those details in such splendid high definition photographs of the raptors perched and in flight with pin sharp images was fabulous. A real treat, a real privilege this evening to have that complete portfolio and all the background information that you gave that can only come from years and years of experience. It was like seeing, having read half a dozen of the best flight identification raptors of Europe type books all rolled up into one. I found myself making lots of notes because of the great tips you gave, like the 4 projecting primaries in Montagues as opposed to 5 in Hen Harrier. Things like that are really gold dust when you are wanting to know what's in front of you in the field. So thank you for all those clear tips and all that information.
My pleasure.
You're also really up to date with the taxonomic treatment, and that was very interesting background. And I loved your introduction, that analytical approach, which I guess we tend to get a bit blasé if we've been bird watching a while and we think, yeah, we know everything in a sense, and forget how we learnt it and what the essentials are when it comes to actually seeing what's in front of you and observing it properly. I was very pleased that you took us back to basics there at the beginning in terms of size, wing to tail dimensions, flight pattern, all that sort of thing, which are okay. We can mentally take in all that, sometimes subconsciously, but I think tonight it was really good to make that point very consciously, that we need all that information to make the right identification. I love some of your anecdotes as well. Merlin always seems to know where it's going, how splendidly put. I love the gyre falcon sequence from the 2 sentinels on their lava percher in Iceland to them having a scrap for the top position. That was lovely. And yes, I think your term for indeterminable marsh harriers, the golden heads, should have its place, because that's a type that really confuses me, and so often I have to put it down to some indeterminate status. Pale iris in young buzzards, I hadn't appreciated either. So lots to take home this evening. It was just such an enjoyable experience listening to you and seeing your images, and we're extremely grateful to you for putting it all together. That takes a lot of time and effort, but the fluency of the talk was great. It would have been lovely to have you actually in front of us, of course, giving the talk, but this was certainly the next best thing. A really super talk, because I can see Anna's saying to everybody, she's right, it was. And thank you very much on behalf of all of the group. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much, Nigel. And could I just thank, if I can thank Kathy, wherever she is, I can't see her, but if I can thank Kathy, because it was Kathy who invited me to come and do the talk in the first place. It's been a real pleasure, and thank you very much for your kind comments, Nigel, and look forward to bumping into you at some stage.
Yeah, vice versa. Thanks.